with an assumption and a set of questions. I start with the assumption that ours is a political age, and even, as Napoleon said, that politics is destiny. What good, then, is poetry in this age? What claim does it have on our attention? Few writers have been more attentive to what Hartman thought of as the apocalyptic forces that poetry channels, embodies, restrains. Writing against a dichotomy of positions in the mid-20th century that insisted either that only politically committed art was relevant, or that real art always had an ironic or detached relationship to politics, Hartman sought after a defense of poetry, Hartman, that would stress once more Shelley's intuition that poets are unacknowledged legislators. Unacknowledged probably because they talk imperatively to the whole of the human condition, not to a special element in it. Poetry, Hartman argued, needed to be understood as art that would be judged as art, not as propaganda. And at the same time, poetry needed to be understood as potentially including anything without needing an ironic detachment from the world of real human lives where politics happens. A first step toward understanding the relation of poetry and politics, Hartman wrote, is to understand the interdependence of great art and popular art. That is to say, the relation between great art and folk traditions, the social forces and organizations we sometimes bracket off with the word culture. I do not want to talk today about the relation of poetry and politics, or the politics of a given poet. Instead, I want to do something more speculative and discuss how poetry is political work. Speculative thought, Hegel wrote in a letter from 1812, is the knowledge that the opposites are in truth one, the knowledge of a reconciliation. It is the most difficult truth, demanding that things that appear in tension or opposition be recognized as unified. I am not interested in understanding poetry as political work on the basis of an analogy between institutions of writing and institutions of socio-economic power, nor on the basis of an analogy between the relations of production and the relations of bits of language. I am not interested in justifying poetry as political work by in some way measuring and demonstrating the political efficacy of single poems or books, nor am I interested in judging the radical possibilities of poetry on the basis of relative popularity or observable ambition for popularity. I am not interested in the idea that the political work that radical poetry is responsible for ought to be focused on or limited to the critique of the institutions of poetry, whether of production, circulation, or mediation. As a poet, and as a volunteer union organizer at the moment with our graduate student union with Unite Here, I have come to believe that the poetry I want to make and the work of labor organizing I do are unified. It is this unity that I want to insist on and struggle to talk about today. So in book 12 of the Prelude, this is passage 1 on your sheet, William Wordsworth wrote about the effect the memory had on him when he returned to a landscape from which he had almost fled as a child, then searching for his guide to help him get away and encountering a visionary dreariness, as he would have. In later years, this landscape had become intenser due to the recollection of those previous powerful feelings. So this is the passage. When, in the blessed hours of early love, a loved one at my side, I roamed in daily presence of this scene, upon the naked pool and dreary crags, and on the melancholy beacon fell a spirit of pleasure that youth's golden gleams. And think ye not with radiance more sublime for these remembrances, and for the power they had left behind? So feeling comes in aid of feeling, and diversity of strength attends us, if but once we have been strong. The language of these last 3 lines strains to express power in life and access to memory. Personal past has been lost, yet seems recoverable. In recovery of this personal past, the present is more intense, gleaming with radiance more sublime for these remembrances. The self works with a former self and finds more power in itself and in the world. Awkwardly, one feeling comes in aid of another. The two feelings are in solidarity with each other. It is not that a memory of a past feeling simply affects a present feeling, but these feelings have entered into a social bond, as one aids and provides strength to the other. For the Wordsworth of the 1800 preface to Lyrical Ballads, thoughts are the representatives of our past feelings, so what he calls here diversity of strength would seem to be a rush of thoughts connected with the feeling that has come in aid. What us do these strength-bringing thoughts attend, and who are the we that well wants strong. It also seems strange to write here of attendant strength and former strength. Why do we need to be strengthened and have been strong? I want to see this as a speculative moment of Wordsworth's verse, when strength and solidarity have a real place in just thinking about childhood. A unity is proposed between mental processes and social relations. A unity is proposed between an individual and a community of strength. At the end of the prelude, where these lines are placed, youth's golden gleam and the radiance more sublime cannot but recall the glory Wordsworth felt in the early days of the French Revolution, a dawn in which he thought it was bliss to be alive. And the glorious dawn itself cannot be remembered without the scenes of misery it was imagined to shine on, and the tyranny and violent executions that followed. The strength of both personal and communal life behind one feeling provides it with aid in the form of another feeling. It becomes more intense, the past becomes present, and the present glows. Here is immortality in the turnings back and forth of Wordsworth's blank verse, in the process of repeated beginnings and returns, in the grammatical confusion and even enthusiasm, as it is momentarily unclear whether it is Wordsworth or the spirit of pleasure that is roaming or falling upon the crags, and the older Wordsworth is interchangeable not only with his younger self, but with the inhuman spirit of pleasure that the two Wordsworths produce in their connection. Immortality in the unity of the remembering self and the remembered community of strength that gives strength to the present. Published in 1804, Wordsworth's Immortality Ode, which I asked people to look over for today, is defined by a struggle to place the origin of immortality in a single spot beyond social life, in the realm of pre-existence that is still recollected in childhood, after we have come to the earth from heaven, trailing clouds of glory. It is a great poem, motivated in part by the suppression of speculative thinking, replaced with metaphysics. Its beauty is the struggle of this suppression. For Hegel, art is the objective form of social memory, giving objective form to the rituals, social structures, and ethical codes of the community. At the same time, art is the objective form of an individual's rejection of critique of these same rituals, structures, and codes. Dissolving and reconstructing social memory is the labor of the artist. The rhapsodic poet's muse, Hegel writes, is Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, and the remembrance of essence that formerly was directly present. Having consumed what Hegel calls the ethical sphere, sort of the political structures in which one lives, and the social rituals, the artist withdraws and dissolves within himself all the firmly established distinctions of his stable existence and the spheres of his organically ordered world. So, alone, the artist eats the universal, gelatinous, cool-based entree of the community and recollects his loneliness because the food doesn't taste like he was told it would. Feeling that the ordered world contains cruelty, tyranny, and unfreedom, the artist is grieved by the division between the good world he has learned to desire and the actual set of tyrannous institutions and political structures that taught him to desire this good world. He mourns the loss of the free and just world he has been taught to want. Having refused to accept any moral or method of production slavishly or unconsciously, out of the purity of himself, he creates a figure of himself which is raised above the real world, in opposition to the world. I'm using he here because Hegel's language, gendered as it is. For Hegel, the origin of the artist is the origin of the subject, who now vomits back a vision of what he has learned he is supposed to desire, and to be as an opposition to the real world. Wordsworth's ode is a struggle against both the social and the individual elements of the artist and artwork. It struggles to relieve itself of both by discovering a pre-social as well as pre-biological origin that dominates his experiences, while he also insists that the experiences of visionary glory are not special or particular to him or anybody. The poem is, in this sense, an attempt to compensate for the social and individual elements of art itself. But Wordsworth has failed to convince himself of the need to compensate himself for that. Few books of poetry in recent years have been so crammed with a piercing force of subjectivity as Keston Sutherland's Odes to TL61P. 5 odes address the now obsolete product code for a hot point dryer, written and revised from 2010 to 2013. The first ode opens with a figure for lyric utterance. Each time you unscrew the head, the truths burn out. A real human is morphed into some container with a top that can be screwed off. But the head is not normally removed, because these truths that it contains will burn out, potentially harming what's outside the container and potentially burning up what is kept inside the container by the screwed-on head, like a chemical that will volatilely react with the air. This is the reification or commodification of humanity. The commodity form keeps the subject, its truths and desires, locked into immiseration, locked into the capitalist relations of production in which the majority of human life and energy on the planet is disciplined and sold for the profit of the capitalists. The commodity form also keeps the subject safe, safe from the truth of its suffering and from the damage its desires could do to its ordered life. Then, this first line of the poem turns at its margin into a block of prose. Each time you unscrew the head, the truths burn out and fly away above the stack of basements inundated in aboriginal mucus, elevating the impeccable, hereafter congenitally depalated Janine, rescaled to a grainy blank up onto the oblong top of the freezer whose shut white lid, unhinged at the back alone, preserves a pyramid of rigid meat budget pizzas. The white space that follows each time you unscrew the head, the truths burn out, is crucially underdetermined. It is the white space that comes after every line of verse, after the line break, or is it the white space that surrounds every prose paragraph once it has been typeset? Does the white space mark poetic intention, or is it what we imagine to be the intentionless margin of any printed page of non-verse writing? How could we tell the difference? Could this line be a line of verse ambiguously? I do not think so. I don't think that this could be a line of ambiguous verse. I think the line loses any ambiguous status. It is the first segment of a single line of prose, a prose paragraph which preserves the memory of its possible original status as a single unit of verse that expressed something about the power and commodification of the subject, but was then lost in a mess of prose. Prose is what verse is reduced to in Sutherland's odes. Prose is achieved by the deprivation of line breaks. Musical units and bars are reprocessed, and their previous metrical and sense qualities are limited. The odes go back and forth between these overwhelming prose paragraphs and sections of some kind of verse. Prose is frequently strictly metrical and was often obviously constructed as some kind of verse. Some of the verse seems very close to prose, and some has had its line boundaries moved around, as on page 18 of the odes, where of 3 slashes used to mark original line boundaries, one has ended up in the middle of a line, one at the start, and one at the end. Prose is no mere metaphor for the processes of commodification of verse, and prose is no mere metaphor for the processes of commodification, and verse is no mere metaphor for the subject. Instead, the loss of certain kinds of verbal art, the limiting of subjective intentions to monolithic forms that are then marketed, are things that have happened and still happen in our capitalism. Alongside an explicit autobiography of Sutherland's sexual history, discourse on the radical power of the subject, and analyses of contemporary political events and structures, Sutherland has composed a history of commodification in a history of verse, in its reduction to prose, as is in the case of lumps of prose composed in what seem to be 17th century iambic tetrameter couplets, relying on hearing words like protection as 4 syllables, protection, and other complex polysyllabic words as metrically simpler. So this is on the handout. As sure as any air must spread, the cost of any breathing head, thrown out to cold perfection on release from its protection, to keep our estimates so rough that each can lean in close enough to bind onto the other free and blind to her obscurity, so every paralysis condemns to cost analysis, etc. 18th century English poets like Alexander Pope would find these scansions of protection and perfection unacceptable. Poets of the 18th century would increasingly avoid placing 3 or 4 syllable words like paralysis and analysis at the end of metrical units because of their metrical instability. It's hard to pronounce analysis or paralysis as analysis or paralysis. It requires a distortion of speech. Commodities are what history, art, and life itself become under capitalism, Sutherland. 17th century verse can only be accessed as a dead piece of capital, purchased in a book or in an education. It is not part of a live tradition, and the commodity form stands between us, here and now, and the flesh and blood composition practices of real 17th century poets. Prose is both a part of and a figure for this total commodification. For Sutherland, history is what cannot be restored or vivified. History is what has been commodified. Yet memory is restorable and can be brought back to life for him. Near the end of the first of the odes to TL61P, in section 1.3, Sutherland writes an explicit counter-struggle against Wordsworth's Immortality ode, trying to find a recoverable bliss in memory that isn't quarantined to recollections of heaven. So this is, I think, number 4. Relief for Abu Naji, I cite its adaptation on bliss in memory, retread via Danny Boy to the drool igloo, pseudo TL61P. Isn't it the problem that I want you to stare at me until our eyes trade sockets, trailing visions, fucking our mutual brains out all over the wrongest floor? Not the implication that Hooding was banned in 1972 that asks for an adaptation on bliss in memory. Light, sockets, the halo pinned to bodies in remorse, devoured in a shadow life sends back. Remember this? I sort through the boxes. My first poems are there, the drawings I made at school are, and my toys are, lead prodigies and barbarians, paints for them, tapes of my rock band, some vinyl of Tchaikovsky and Bach, the present photographs of my first sexual lover, whose face is staring with intent euphoria and deepening tenderness at the face I was. The eyes I shone in then. The light in them blinds me now to nothing less than under your caress I can do still, and do still even right now, or very soon do, when I climb into bed with you and let my arms shrink into your waking head, or sleeping, however you are in there, that room of objects and that room of you. The repeated phrase adaptation on bliss in memory comes as part of a request for a revision and expansion of Wordsworth's concept of bliss in memory. Bliss is a key word for Wordsworth, who beholds the child in his newborn blisses and knows the fullness of a child's bliss. Those are quotes from Immortality. While for Wordsworth the child comes trailing clouds of glory from heaven, Sutherland requests an adaptation on bliss in memory for 2 reasons in this passage. First, on account of relief for Abu Naji, where the British had an army base in Iraq, which they left in 2006. This was celebrated as the first expulsion of the American-led coalition forces from an urban centre. It was celebrated as a victory against imperialism that for Sutherland must be recognised as a potential memory and source of bliss for the Iraqis who looted and demolished the abandoned camp. Second, on account of sexual fantasy. I want you to stare at me until our eyes trade sockets, trailing visions, fucking our mutual brains out all over the wrongest floor. Fantasies of sexual intercourse are the trailing visions of bliss created by a powerful experience of desire, opposed to the trailing clouds of glory that the child hangs on to after he leaves heaven in Wordsworth's ode. The verse breaks out of the prose in high disorder. There is a hint of metrical order, of near blank verse units where metrical and syntactic divisions coincide, which the poet has struggled but failed to preserve. The halo pinned to bodies in remorse, devoured in a shadow life sends back. Remember this? I sort through the boxes. But the first of these 3 lines has sockets stuck to the front, and after them the verse becomes even more disordered with awkward hints of order. So this follows. My first poems are there, the drawings I made at school are, and my toys are, lead prodigies and barbarians, paints for them, tapes of my rock band. The first 3 of these 4 lines seem to be structured around the principle that each line contains one verb in the description of the objects that are in the boxes. But the grammar that is produced is a clumsy attempt at parallelism, with the line breaks placed without attention to anything but making sure each line has an R in it. So one line break comes between the and drawings, and the next comes after the next R. The 4th of these lines starts with a capital P, as though that would prove the metrical order by recalling the practice of capitalizing the first word in every line of verse. But this bad verse survives and escapes the prose, no matter how close it is to it. And the memories are present when the poet discovers the photograph of this first sexual lover, who in the present tense stares at the face he was. A line break between the I and the was suspends the knowledge of the pastness of the photo. The lover momentarily stares at the face he is, and the memory is vivified by verse technique itself, existing in the past and present at the same time. Quickly, the memory of this first sexual lover binds the poet to an addressed you in the present. This provisional distinction in Sutherland's work between history and memory, one of which has been commodified and is inaccessible, one of which hasn't and can be experienced as present, is the central break or contradiction of Sutherland's Ode to TL61P. Though each is written in the other mode at points, the form of one is prose that deprives its material of its original qualities, and the form of the other is a verse that tries desperately to preserve these qualities. But how do memory and history relate to each other? A speculative unity between the two, as in Wordsworth's "If but once we have been strong," is hard to come by. The solution that preoccupies the poem is this. Passionate reclamation of memory, in spite of the perilous weakness of verse and technique and the felt difficulty of eloquently uttering personal experience in lyric, will allow a reclamation of history. An insistence on the powerful livingness of one's own memories and life is a struggle against commodification. An insistence on how bliss is created in real social life, in sexual desire and political experience, makes the subject immortal, resistant to commodification, even if ever so fleetingly, resistant to the processes of history as they are imagined. In such moments, the subject no longer has to accept the few possibilities, the few life choices that are presented as the inescapable options. All of my life is vividly available to me. If that is the case, why should I believe the myth that the economic and political structures that govern my life are rigid and inaccessible? If I am not a victim of the course of my own life up until this point, why should I accept that I am a victim of history? Sutherland's weak verse offers a struggle to reclaim the power of Wordsworth's Immortality ode from its own submissive qualities. As the work of poetry is to create an object that knows this, in which I know this and in which others can know this, the work of one-on-one labour organising, as I have experienced it in New Haven, is to find a way of communicating that contains this knowledge, where the person I am talking to knows this and where I know this, through each making public the memories and desires that do not appear to be present or realisable. Poetry and labour organising both demand a performance of absolutely intense personal experience for others, a level of passion that refuses the social conventions and conditions that produce consciousness and bind it to the back of the skull. Collective politics does not require less subjectivity, but more.